like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
All right, so let's jump into a deep dive into, well, a situation that honestly seems to be changing by the hour.
Yeah.
And we're talking about...
Pretty wild.
Yeah, it is.
We're talking about the war in Ukraine. You know, it's coming up on year 3.
Yeah, and just when we thought we'd seen everything, things take a really sharp turn.
And it's almost like somebody just hit that fast forward button.
Yeah, the timing is what I find particularly striking. Just days after the U.S. election.
Right.
We've got North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine alongside Russian forces.
Yeah, and then on top of that, Biden makes this decision that could just completely flip the script on how this war is going.
Yeah, and we're trying to make sense of all of this for you today. We've got news reports, insider accounts, even Zelensky's own words, so...
It's going to be a lot.
It is. What's emerging is, well, it's complex, right?
Yeah.
Strategic maneuvering, calculated risks, and potential consequences that are honestly really hard to even grasp at this point.
Right. We've got to connect the dots between Biden's move, which has been called controversial, the North Korean deployment, and, well, the big question mark hanging over the new U.S. administration.
Okay, so let's just get right into it. Biden has just given Ukraine basically the green light to use those U.S.-supplied ATACMS missiles inside Russia.
Yep.
And specifically targeting the Kursk region. And for months, the U.S. has resisted this, saying they were afraid it could escalate things beyond control. So why the sudden shift? Why now?
Well, you have to consider the ATACMS range, right? These missiles can hit targets much deeper inside Russia than anything Ukraine had access to before. It completely changes the battlefield. Puts pressure on Russian logistics, command centers, all that stuff far away from the front lines.
So it's not just about hitting any target, but hitting the right targets to kind of mess up Russia's entire war effort.
Precisely. You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And the timing of this decision, right after the North Korean troop deployment, that can't be a coincidence.
Right.
I mean, 10,000 soldiers might not seem like a lot when you compare that to the overall forces involved.
Right.
But even in a defensive role, it frees up Russian troops for offensive operations in other places.
So it's like a force multiplier for Russia, even if it wasn't intentional on North Korea's part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's another piece of this puzzle from our sources.
Okay.
Biden secretly authorized ATACMS for use within Ukraine way back in February, delivered in April.
Wow.
But this was kept quiet.
So they were playing like a deeper game than we realized, getting those missiles in place just in case, in case things unfolded like they are now.
Yeah, looks like it.
Yeah.
So the U.S. has been preparing for this possibility for a while now, even while they were publicly saying, let's be cautious.
Wow, okay. But why target Kursk specifically? It's not just some random spot on the map, right?
No. Kursk is incredibly important strategically. Southern Russia, right on the border with Ukraine.
Right.
And remember, it was the site of Kyiv's recent counteroffensive. They did manage to push Russian forces back there, but it's still really contested.
And I'm guessing Russia doesn't want to give up that territory very easily.
You got it. They're sending a lot of troops into Kursk right now.
Yeah.
Our intelligence estimates almost 50,000. The goal is clear, to make Kursk a non-starter in any future peace talks.
Right.
They want a firm grip on that region so they can dictate the terms of any kind of settlement.
So by allowing Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia, in Kursk specifically, Biden is challenging that. He's saying the U.S. won't just stand by and let Russia decide how this plays out. It's a bold play, but there have to be risks involved, right?
Oh, absolutely. This kind of move, there are potential consequences, and we're only beginning to understand what those could be.
Right.
But before we get into that, there's another intriguing piece to all of this. Zelensky's victory plan. He gave Biden a list of targets in Russia that he wanted to hit with these long-range missiles.
So this wasn't a case of give us the weapons and we'll figure it out. Yeah. Zelensky had specific targets as part of a bigger plan.
That's exactly what our source is telling us, yeah. They're calling it a key part of Zelensky's plan to win, not just to hold on, defensively.
Wow.
And his response, when the news broke, missiles will speak for themselves. Pretty confident statement, especially considering what Ukraine is up against right now.
Yeah, it sounds like Zelensky is really betting big on these ATCMS to change the direction of this war.
He is.
But what does this victory plan tell us about Ukraine's overall strategy? Are they shifting from defense to offense? Are they willing to take bigger risks?
That's a question we're going to need to explore.
Yeah.
But first, we have to consider a major event that happened right here in the U.S. just days before this decision was made.
You're talking about the election.
Yes.
Trump, who has consistently downplayed the war, is now the president-elect. And now he gets to deal with this crazy complex situation with a whole bunch of unknowns.
Exactly. And there's another layer to this that's crucial.
Okay.
The U.S. and its allies were actively trying to Trump-proof aid to Ukraine.
So they were trying to set up funding and agreements so that even if Trump won, he wouldn't be able to just reverse course on supporting Ukraine.
Exactly. But with this decision, made just days before he takes office, you almost have to wonder if it forces his hand. He has to react somehow. And what's interesting is that Zelensky seems to believe that the war will end faster under Trump. Now, whether that's realism or wishful thinking is a whole other debate.
Yeah, that's a huge question mark. And the big question on everyone's mind is, how will Trump, who is known for his unpredictable foreign policy, how will he react to this decision that Biden basically just dropped in his lap? This has the potential to create major tension internationally on top of everything else that's going on.
It really does. And it's all happening with, well, a very real threat looming over everything, escalation.
Right. Back in September, Putin gave that warning to the West, remember? Attacking Russia with conventional missiles could trigger a nuclear response. And Biden's decision definitely raises the stakes.
No question. It's the unspoken truth that is hanging over this whole situation. The U.S. has downplayed the risk. They've cited limited ATACMS supplies and Ukraine's existing drone capabilities. But adding long-range missiles into this equation definitely changes the dynamic.
Yeah, it does. It's a calculated risk. We've gone from North Korean boots on the ground to long-range missiles targeting Russia in a matter of days. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And to understand what the potential consequences of Biden's decision might be, we have to think about the wider picture, the implications not just for this conflict, but for global power as a whole. That's what we'll pick up in part 2.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. So as we try to figure out what the fallout from Biden's decision might be, it's really important to keep in mind the balance of power at play here.
Right. And, we've got Russia feeling the pressure in Kursk, Ukraine obviously emboldened by this new capability, and the U.S. navigating all of this with a new and, well, let's face it, a pretty unpredictable administration about to take over.
Exactly. And remember, Biden's decision isn't just sending a message to Moscow, it's also sending a message to Pyongyang.
Okay.
It signals that the U.S. is willing to challenge North Korea getting involved in this, maybe as a way to deter them from supporting Russia even more.
So it's almost like drawing a line in the sand saying, this is as far as you go. But could that provoke an even stronger reaction? Because North Korea isn't exactly known for being, well, reasonable.
That's a valid concern. Their track record suggests they're capable of doing some pretty unpredictable and destabilizing things.
Right.
Their alliance with Russia, even if it seems like they're just taking advantage of the situation, adds a level of volatility we can't ignore.
Yeah, speaking of volatility, let's talk about the big, elephant in the room, the nuclear threat. Putin's warning back in September was pretty scary. Is Biden playing with fire here?
Well, it's the thing nobody wants to talk about, but we have to. While the U.S. says Ukraine will use these missiles carefully and that their drones are a less risky option, the reality is long-range missiles just change everything. It's a new level of risk that wasn't there before.
It does, you're right. It changes the whole dynamic. Now targets deep inside Russia are suddenly within reach, and that could push Putin to make a really bad decision. He might feel like he has no choice but to lash out in a way that we haven't seen yet.
Exactly. And even if he doesn't use nukes, there are other ways he could escalate things. Cyber attacks, targeting infrastructure in the West, maybe expanding the conflict to other nearby countries. These are all things we have to consider.
It's a really high-stakes game with potentially devastating consequences. And on top of all of this, we have the incoming Trump administration to think about. It's like trying to predict the weather months in advance.
Yeah. Trump's unpredictability makes it almost impossible to know how he'll react to the situation. Will he increase support for Ukraine even more, risking further escalation with Russia? Or will he try to appease Putin and maybe undermine U.S. credibility, or even worse, just abandon Ukraine altogether?
He's praised Putin before, questioned NATO, even suggested that the U.S. should just pull out of the conflict completely. It's hard to see how those statements line up with strong support for Ukraine.
Exactly. So why would Zelensky say he's confident Trump will bring a quick end to the war? Is he just being really optimistic? Is it some kind of calculated gamble? Or does he maybe know something that we don't?
Yeah, it's a real mystery. And it makes you wonder about Ukraine's own strategy here. Are they counting on a Trump win to get them out of this? And what happens if that doesn't pan out?
It's definitely risky. There's no doubt about that. And it just adds more uncertainty to a situation that's already incredibly volatile.
We talked before about how the U.S. was trying to Trump-proof the aid to Ukraine to guarantee support no matter who won the election. But hasn't Biden's decision kind of messed that plan up?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
By doing this just days before Trump takes over, it forces his hand. He can't just ignore it. He's got to react.
Right.
And that reaction, well, it could be anything from complete support for Ukraine to completely changing U.S. policy.
So we really are in uncharted territory here. No idea what Trump will do, how Putin will respond, or what North Korea's role in all of this will actually be.
That's where we are, yes. But that doesn't mean we give up. It just means we have to be even more careful, more skeptical, and really challenge the assumptions that we might have and look for different perspectives.
Right. It's really easy to get caught up in the headlines, the emotional appeals, the simple narratives. But it's so important to step back and look at all of this with a critical eye.
Exactly. We should ask ourselves, who benefits from the story being told this way? What are their motives? What are the potential consequences, both the ones they intend and the ones they don't?
Because in a situation like this, the stakes are just so high. We aren't just talking about Ukraine or the balance of power in Europe. We're talking about a potential conflict that could have repercussions for everyone.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to have these discussions, to understand how complex this is, and to challenge our own biases. Because the only way we can navigate all of this and avoid the worst-case scenarios is by understanding it.
So where do we go from here? We've got this crazy web of global politics, the threat of things escalating, and a new administration coming in that doesn't have the best track record on foreign policy.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to cover in the last part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll look at what might happen, the key players to watch, and the questions that are still unanswered.
All right. Stay with us. We're just getting started. Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive. We've talked about a lot, from North Korean troops actually being on the ground in Ukraine to Biden's decision to let those long-range missiles be used against targets in Russia.
It's been, well, a lot to take in.
It really has.
What we're seeing is a bunch of crises all happening at the same time, and each one has its own set of wild cards. It makes it almost impossible to figure out what happens next.
Right, and we can't forget that someone like Trump is now in charge. His foreign policy has never been, let's just say, predictable.
That's putting it mildly. One day it's praising Putin, the next it's pulling out of NATO. So how can we even begin to guess what he'll do about Ukraine?
Yeah, good question. I mean, on the one hand, he could really ramp up support for Ukraine, send more weapons, get tougher on Russia.
It's possible, sure, but you also have to remember what drives Trump. He loves a good deal. So he might see this as a chance to broker some big peace agreement, something that makes him look like a global leader.
It's all about how things look to him, right? Like maybe he's thinking he can pull off a Nixon goes to China type of thing.
Exactly. But what if he just decides Ukraine is more trouble than it's worth? He could cut off aid and basically force Zelensky to take whatever deal Russia offers, even if it's a bad one.
That would be terrible for Ukraine, and it would tell the whole world that the U.S. can't be trusted, that they'll drop their allies as soon as things get tough.
And it's not just about Ukraine. Think about the impact on global security. If Russia thinks they can get away with this because the U.S. is backing down, what's to stop them from going after other countries?
So it seems like we've got two completely opposite scenarios: Trump the peacemaker or Trump the isolationist. And both paths could have huge consequences, not just for Ukraine, but for everyone.
That's the situation. And we still have to figure out how Russia will react to what Biden has done. Will they see it as a provocation, something that needs a strong response?
Especially with what Putin said a while back about maybe using nuclear weapons if Russia is attacked. That's a terrifying thought, and it's hard to know if he's serious or not.
Yeah, that's the problem. We can't completely rule out the possibility of a nuclear conflict, no matter how unlikely it might seem.
Yeah.
And even if he doesn't go that far, there are still other ways Russia could hit back. cyber attacks against essential services in the West, or even extending the fighting into neighboring countries. It's all pretty unsettling.
And then there's North Korea, just to add to the fun. They've already sent troops to help Russia in Kursk, but we don't really know what their game is.
Right, they're a wild card. They could do anything. It just shows how messy and dangerous this conflict is. One wrong move, one miscalculation could have disastrous results.
So what's a regular person supposed to do with all of this? It feels like the ground is constantly shifting under our feet.
It is overwhelming. I think the best thing to do is stay informed, question everything, and don't fall for simple explanations.
We need to think critically about the information we're getting. Look past the headlines and try to see different sides of the story.
This isn't a black and white situation. There are a lot of different interests at play, and it's hard to see what's really going on with all the confusion of war.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. But even without all the information, we can still try to understand how complex it is and challenge our own assumptions.
That's the point. That's how we become better citizens, how we can have better discussions, and how we can demand better solutions from our leaders.
And in the end, isn't that what this all comes down to? Trying to understand a world that is getting more and more complicated and connected, a world where decisions made in faraway places can affect everyone.
I think you're right. We can't just ignore what's happening. We have to face these tough issues head on, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Because there's too much at stake. We're talking about war and peace, the threat of nuclear weapons, the future of our planet. These are things we need to be discussing.
I completely agree. We can't predict the future, but we can prepare ourselves by learning as much as we can and thinking critically about the information we receive so we can deal with whatever comes next.
So, to everyone listening, stay curious, stay involved, and stay informed. This story is far from over, and the more we understand, the better prepared we'll be to face the challenges that are coming.
Well said. We've just scratched the surface of this incredibly complex issue, but hopefully our deep dive has given you something to think about and maybe a better understanding of how global politics really works.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll be back soon to explore another pressing issue facing our world.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down.